and would run in any direction, it never felt like I was actually moving at all. Each time I'd have this dream, I'd eventually turn around to see a creature standing upright. The creature's legs were deer legs, its torso was human, and its head was the skull of a buck. It also had long claws like fingers on its hands. This creature would never say anything at first, but it eventually started screaming in an ear-bustingly loud manner. "The ones you love do not speak the truth." It would say this again and again. I would later find out it spoke the truth. Shortly after the dreams, my parents got a divorce, and I'd find out my dad was not truly sober, and my mom was lying about not having cheated on my dad. These dreams were mortifying for someone at my age. They went on for about 4 months before they abruptly stopped. I have not had these dreams since, and I have never touched a Ouija board again. Last year, from late August through all of September, I began researching things about the occult, the paranormal, and even lore and such like skinwalkers. I knew of a few other people who had done the same in the past, and their paranoia grew the more they researched such things. I have had a similar experience since researching these things. As for my story, things started off pretty standard. I got a feeling of being creeped out. Having done enough research on the paranormal and having experienced enough paranormal things myself, I brushed the feeling off as nothing. As time went on, the dog in the neighbor's yard started losing it roughly 2 to 3 hours at a time, for a period of 3 weeks or so. This seemed to be happening for no reason. This, combined with my uneasy previous feelings, was enough to make me stop going out to smoke at night. Eventually, this stopped for a short time. One late August night, I had a friend over, and felt comfortable enough to go out and have a smoke when the neighbor's dog suddenly started barking. It was going crazy, like it was going insane. Observing the dog's behavior, we thought it odd. Suddenly, my friend stopped and stared over at the tree next to the doghouse. Weirded out, I questioned my friend's behavior, at which point she informed me that she saw what looked like a person near the tree. Looking over, I saw nothing, but I couldn't shake the unease. The next 2 mornings, my friend got up for work and informed me she saw a dog we'd never seen before lurking around her car. She said every time it'd just stare and growl before leaving entirely. We weren't sure what was up, but we even discovered handprints on the glass outside of my window underneath the screen. I'm not sure if this thing is a skinwalker, a stray dog, or something else entirely, but it didn't feel exactly normal. This, coupled with the oddities happening around my house, have led me to believe that some more nefarious thing could be happening. I'm open to any theories anyone may have. For now, though, it remains a mystery. I used to hunt fairly often. The day everything changed started off relatively normal. In the end, however, I would never go hunting again. It was a hot summer day and I was wandering the woods, heading for my tree stand. I really enjoyed nature, and so when I reached my tree, I sat down feeling fairly relaxed and excited at the idea of another day out in nature. This would change rather quickly. I was sitting there for a solid 67 seconds when I hear a noise. It didn't sound like the normal deer or coyote I hunted. It was odd, and it startled me at first. Eventually, the noise went away though, so I forgot about it. I got a little stir-crazy, and after a bit I began walking. About 6 or 7 minutes into my walk, I heard the strange noise again. Baffled and a little curious, I look through the scope of my rifle, and that's when I see something I have never seen before. The mere sight of the thing had me sprinting through the woods. It looked part human and part monster, but when it got closer, I saw it was a man with a knife. Freaked out at the presence of this guy, I ran. It wasn't more than a few seconds before he somehow caught up with me. At that moment, I was so startled by this I shot him. This quote-unquote man slowed down and began screaming in pain. I thought to myself, I stopped my pursuer. Good. The thought was short-lived, however. As soon as he starts running again, I'm at a loss, like what the hell? I'm positive I shot this guy and he shouldn't be running. It was clear he could outrun me, so I thought the next best thing I could do was try to hide. I ducked behind a rock, the only cover I could find close to me, and this man or thing slows down and starts walking right in my direction. I think I'm screwed, and am preparing to unload everything I have into the sky when he stops right in front of me. And by some saving grace of God, another shot goes off in the distance. The strange man runs in the direction of the shot, and seeing my only opportunity to escape, I book it to my house. The second I got home, I called the cops and they went to check the woods. It took them a solid 2 hours before they finally came back. They informed me they searched high and low for this quote-unquote man, but they couldn't find anyone. They didn't even find evidence of anyone out there besides myself. I thanked the officers for the time and decided that right then and there I was never hunting again. I looked into things such as wendigos, skinwalkers, flesh skates, and all those kind of things. And I kind of think it fits into there. Let me know what you guys think in the comments though. I need some advice. I don't want to give up my location, but I will say I'm in an area based close to Navajo land. The most identifying information I can give is I'm in Maricopa County. My issue is that I work at night, and about mid-April, I noticed something strange. I've never heard bird calls at night until this happened. I stopped my car to have a smoke, and was getting ready to hop out when I had the striking feeling to turn my radio down and roll down my window and listen. The well-lit parking lot I was in filled with what sounded like this weird noise. It sounded like 3 loud bird calls is the best I can say. It was like several birds were talking loudly across the parking lot at each other. The sound was piercing and tittering, and the bird calls itself filtered through what sounded like several types of different calls, all in a single sequence. I got the sense these birds were practicing their types of calls or something, if that makes any sense. They were loud and did not stop, but chittered faster and more excitedly as I stepped out with my smoke and lighter. My chest tightened with panic, and the darkness that pressed against the edge of the parking lot filled me with deep terror. I climbed right back into my car and got the hell out of there. As I drove away, I caught sight of my car's clock and tried not to think about how unsettling it was that birds were so active at 1 a.m. I heard that ominous, cycling bird call follow me to work and home for the next week after that. It didn't take a single day off. One time in the early morning I heard it begin to imitate a younger sounding bird, and since then it's varied between that and the cycling chirps. The week after that, the calls have been present but less persistent. Tonight, I had a dream I was driving with a neighbor I'd never met before, when a human-sized animal on 2 legs came up to the car and stopped it, placing its fur molted mushroom-colored hands or hooves on my passenger side of the hood. I wanted to scream and warn my neighbor, "That's it! That's the skinwalker!" But before I could say anything, and before I knew the creature would turn its head to look at me, and I would wake up. I had this dream today, and I knew I needed to ask for help. I've had several Navajo clients who I've thought of asking, but I didn't want to be rude or bring up bad luck, so I'm hoping to find some help here. My gut instinct is telling me to just punch this thing in the face if it shows up, but I figured I should find out the correct answer before I came to that. Since the first parking lot incident, I've strongly felt that this is a skinwalker, and I'm not sure why. Thanks for listening to these allegedly true, creepy skinwalker and wendigo stories. These were some pretty creepy ones if I do say so myself, and I definitely don't want to run into any of these monsters. If you have a story you would like to share in a future video, be sure to send it in at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that really do keep this channel going. If you're new to the channel, why not hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to never miss a new video. I upload them almost every single day on all things natural and supernatural. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, it helps me out a ton. I'll see you guys soon with another creepy video. No matter what military force around the world you may have been a part of, I salute you nonetheless for your service. Defending your country and the rights it so strongly believes is a service many underestimate. These military personnel shared some of their truly creepy stories about their time in the service. Some of these are encounters while in active duty and others aren't. If you have a story you would like to share on the show, whether it be a military story or something else, submit it at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story on a future episode. Now, without further hesitation, let's get into these allegedly true, creepy military stories. Now, my dad was a former U.S. Army, Navy, and later became a biker once he was back stateside for good. He had seen a lot and shared as many of his experience with me as he was able before he passed in 2011. If you don't mind, I'd like to share a few more of them with you. This is a story from my dad back when he was in the Navy. It was close to the end of the Vietnam War, and the ship they had just boarded had seen a lot of combat missions. I will try to tell this story from his perspective as best as I can remember. One evening, I had just finished PT, and my buddy and I were headed to the mess hall by ourselves. We had been walking through the ship, and minus the sounds of the engines far away and the sounds of waves sloshing the side of our ship, all was quiet, since most of our crew was either in the mess, in their quarters, or at their stations on deck. At one point during the walk, we arrived at a multi-level crosswalk with one below and another above the one that we were currently walking on. You can definitely tell when anyone is on or near another. The sounds echo in space. Though tight, it was open. Our crosswalk was a straight shot to the mess hall. As we were walking and laughing, we heard the door behind us open and close. Now this is a heavy metal door. Not one that you can just open without a lot of purpose. We turned and stopped, thinking another one of our squad decided to join us. But there was no one there. Confused, I looked at my buddy and he just shrugged. He turned around to continue on, but before we could take a step, we heard very loud footfalls again. We turned back around and all the sound of the steps, but again, there was no one. The footsteps grew louder, and we began looking at the other crosswalks to see if anyone is there. Nothing. It's such an open space, you would see someone no matter what. When the sounds were about halfway to us, we began to feel the vibrations from those steps on the metal railing and floor. My hair stood up on end. A cold feeling began on the back of my neck. Mind you, I saw combat already in Vietnam as a staff sergeant when I was previously with the U.S. Army. I'd seen some of the worst of humanity out there. There wasn't much that could really frighten me anymore. This was bizarre. Slowly, my buddy and I turned to each other, and in mutual agreement, we both decided we were going to back away from this situation. So, we began backing away. I think once we heard our footsteps out of sync with the others, it became real to us. Like, this is really happening. We took off like a shot. We ran all the way to the end of the crosswalk and burst through the doors into the mess hall with panicked looks directed back at the way we came. One of the naval officers closest to the door started asking us what the heck we were doing causing such a ruckus. Truthfully, we didn't want to say that 2 seasoned Navy men were running balls to the wall into the mess of fear of being called cowardly. I think the freaked out looks on our faces gave us away since the officer developed a look of understanding. His eyes landed on the doors and we hurried through as he nodded almost solemnly. We knew then that this was not the first time it had happened to someone. Between constant career changes, extensive travel, and unusual upbringings, I can safely say I led an exceptionally rich life. This being said, I have lots of stories, albeit few are probably appropriate for the horror theme of this channel. Still, I figured I'd share one of the things that happened to me, and maybe we'll see if there's desire for more. They say everyone's army experience is different. Some people gauge the enemy in close combat, others never even deploy. People have different jobs, and really there's no way to sum it up in a single sentence or phrase to people who haven't experienced it. Oddly enough, I feel like the story is the best illustration of my life as to how real the phrase really is. During my enlistment, I was stationed in a base in the Chihuahuan Desert. It was a pretty boring place, with not much besides sand dunes, long stretches of sun-shattered highway, scalding heat, and a plethora of impoverished people surrounding the base. That being said, there wasn't much to do unless you go off post. It was at this duty station where I met my friend Forrest. Forrest was a really great guy. Like myself, he signed up for the army because he legitimately wanted to serve his country. While he was very, very intelligent, he wound up being in the infantry out of dedication. Anyway, being such a nice dude, Forrest was inclined to give those of us who didn't have a vehicle at the time rides in the town. It was always nice driving in his sports car, so on boring weekends, I'd ride along whenever he felt like driving somewhere. On this particular day, I don't remember where we were going, but we were going down an open highway. Since we're off post cruising through a little Latino area, Forrest was going a lot faster than he normally might under the circumstances. You see, on the post they pull you over for going even 1 mile over the speed limit. That means guys would really book it when they got off the post. Anyway, we were bolting down this desert freeway when we noticed a box in the distance. Looking back, the conversation as I remember, it was only a few seconds. Through the piercing of the wind, I heard his voice as he began steering the car towards the box. "Hey, see that box in the road? I'm gonna hit it." Laughing, I responded how that would be funny, but whoever was inside might mess up his car, so he shouldn't. With a defeated smile, he swiftly steered away and said I was probably right. The desert was littered with junk, and hitting it at the speed might not be as much fun as it would seem to, 2 bored privates. As I said, the conversation took all maybe of 6 seconds. As Forrest passed by and nearly hit the box, we immediately saw movement in the rearview mirror. We weren't really prepared for what happened next. No, it wasn't an alien or a cryptid species. Instead, a child crawled out of the cardboard box, stood up, and ran away. I turned to Forrest and he was literally in shock. He didn't seem to have any idea of how he was supposed to react. It was like he didn't even believe what he just saw. What, was that a kid?" he asked, completely mortified. "Yeah, that was definitely a kid," I said, laughing. "Good thing you didn't hit that box." We spent the rest of the ride asking rhetorical questions, like why a kid was in the box in the middle of the desert. There wasn't a nearby town for quite some time. Eventually, reasoning the kid might have been a developmental disability kid or something, we turned back to check on the situation. There was a box but no sign of the kid. So when I think back to that phrase about how everyone's military experience is different, I can't help but try to figure out where this story fits in the narrative of my life. I am a 6-foot female who is now 25. Back in 2013, I decided to enlist in the Navy in order to pay for my college education. I was placed into the job of an aviation ordnance man and was sent to serve on the USS Peleliu. I'll do my best to explain all of this, and to those with no military background. The USS Peleliu was an LHA or amphibious assault ship. This is basically one size down from an aircraft carrier, so pretty large, housing about 3,000 people when it's at full capacity. Just a big metal floating city. The top is a flight deck like you see in the movies like Top Gun, but isn't quite big enough for an aircraft that require a runway like jets. These ships launch different types of helicopters and Harriers, fixed-wings aircraft that can take off and land vertically. The amphibious part refers to the fact that the back of the ship opens and floods to launch small boats, typically full of Marines and small trucks. As an aviation ordnance man assigned to the G3 division on the ship, I worked in the spaces down in the deep parts of the ship below the waterline where all the weapons these aircraft would carry were stored. Large elevators carry the weapons up to the flight deck to be loaded onto the aircraft. This story took place in 2014 when the ship was out on deployment. We were in the middle of the ocean, thousands of miles away from US soil. I worked the night shift from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. This meant that most of my shift took place during the darkening on the ship when all the lights that could be seen from the outside of the ship were turned off and switched over to red lights, as to not give away our position. So, as I said, I am a female. At the time, I was 21. Also on my shift there were 3 males around my age and maybe a little slightly older. One other man worked in the office space a floor up from our shop, manning the phone and the desk in the case of an emergency. This was the Peleliu's last deployment, as the ship was about 35 years old. There were several ghost stories that would go around, and certain spaces really freaked me out at night. As an example, the small dumbwaiter that carried food from the lower storage spaces up to the crew's kitchen had been out of commission for some time, supposedly because years prior it had malfunctioned and a Marine looked into the shaft to try to see it was gone. As the story goes, while he was looking, the dumbwaiter fell and took his head straight off. There were lots of stories like that. So, on this particular night, we did our turnover with the day shift. We didn't have much to do that night, but we didn't want the day shift guys to know this, or else they would give us their busy work. So while we were waiting for them to finish writing emails home and clear out of our shop, my supervisor said we should all go down to one of the magazines and wait there. Out of sight, out of mind, as they say. So we went down to the magazine. Magazine 10 to be exact. Trying to describe where this is located in full detail would be very difficult for someone who's never been on a ship, so I'll stick with the spark notes. You had to climb down to a fairly out-of-the-way part of the ship that was known as Shaft Alley. It was called this because it was a small room with 4 scuttles on the floor. If you opened any one of them, you would see a ladder that went straight down about 3 stories. If the scuttle was open, you could step right into the hole and fall. It was fairly terrifying. Once you made it down one of these ladders, you would find yourself facing a large door with a high security lock on it. Only the people in my division were authorized to have the key, once they were put on the access list, that is. We had to check out the key from the armory. It was not a space that was just allowed to be walked into, or that anyone who I didn't work directly with would even have the reason to know where it was. Once you opened the door, there were 2 large rooms filling the inventory, and in one of the rooms, there was another scuttle that leads down one deck into another room. Each room had a thermometer in it, and the night shift was responsible for recording the room temperature from each of them every night to make sure space never got too hot for the hazardous material stored down there. So, anyway, we go down to the magazine and close the door behind us. The guys all make themselves comfortable and make casual chit-chat while I put down my backpack in the corner and take down all of the temperatures, so we wouldn't have to come back down later. Once I was done, I sat on the floor, opened up my backpack and started doing homework for a distance college course that I was taking at the time. Somewhere, while I was doing my homework, I fell asleep. I woke up in a panic, with drool all over my assignment. Great. I walked between the rooms of the magazine and called out to see if anyone was still there with me, but I was alone. I went back over to my books and started loading up my backpack to leave when I noticed a pair of dark eyes looking directly at me from behind some pallets. For some reason, unpanicked, I said, "Hello?" in a friendly voice. The eyes and the dark figure, they seemed to be attached and darted to another pallet beyond my view. Just when we hear someone enter the room, the main door to the magazine in the other room, I go over to check it out and see Johnson, the kid who works in the office space upstairs during the night shift. Confused, I asked, "What are you doing down here?" He explains that our boss had asked him to take an inventory. As I'm offering to help him, we both hear a crash on the other side of the room, where my backpack is, and look at each other, totally freaked out. He says, "Who else is down here?" To which I reply, "No one." Just as I say this, out of the other room darts a little girl. She looked about 9 years old and completely unkempt and was wearing a pair of children's pajamas that were about 2 sizes too small. She darts across the room and down the scuttle into the lower space. Just then, I wake up. I'm still in the magazine on my homework, just like before, drool and all. Pretty spooked, I sit up and look around. I'm still alone. While I'm still trying to gain my bearings and shake off the nightmare, I hear someone entering through the main door of the room. I walk over, and wouldn't you know it, it's Johnson. I say, "What are you doing here?" again, but this time I'm shaking. He says, "I just told you, Chief wants an inventory." I stare at him for a second and say, You just told me like a minute ago? I just talked to you? That actually happened." He looked at me like I was crazy and he was like, "Yeah." To this I respond, "Then there's a little girl in the lower?" And just then we hear a blood-curdling scream coming from the lower space. I'm getting goosebumps now just typing it. The scream scares the hell out of me and jolts me awake, alone in the magazine, face drool covered in the assignment again. This time I'm terrified out of my mind, and I've started crying. I run immediately over to the phone on the wall and call upstairs to my shop. My supervisor answers, "Firebomb, Petty Officer Lutton speaking. How may I help you, sir, ma'am, or chief?" I sputter out shakily, Hey, this is Glover, I'm in 10, you guys left me down here." He chuckles and says, "Yeah man, you passed out." I reply, "If I'm not in the shop in 10 minutes, please send someone down to get me." He hesitates, clearly a little annoyed, but he can hear I'm really scared and says, okay. I pack my backpack, lock the space, and fly up the ladder like a bat out of hell. When I got to my shop, I told the guys what happened, and they spent the next several days mocking me mercifully over it, joking that I'm a medium and I talk to dead kids in my dreams. I now go to a different space to record those temperatures at night, and Davis goes down to 10. About 2 weeks later, we're all in the shop and Davis goes down to record his temperatures for the night. He had been the worst about making fun of me, so he didn't mind going down to that haunted magazine. This night he comes back to the shop white as a sheet saying, nope, screw that, to himself over and over. Whenever we asked him what happened, he says that while he was climbing down the ladder, he could hear a little girl singing, clear as day. He was so scared he came straight back up and didn't even get the temperatures. He wouldn't go down there alone after that either. This stayed a joke in my division for some time. Then, several months later in the deployment, one of the new guys that had been sent upstairs to work in the office's kitchen for a few weeks comes back. We ask him how his time up there was, and he tells us he met the captain of the ship. From the way he told the story, the captain said hello and asked the new guy what his job normally was, to which the kid answered that he was an ordnance man. The captain said, "Oh, so you work down in the magazines. Have you met the Shaft Alley Sally yet?" The new guy said no and asked the captain who Shaft Alley Sally was. The captain tells him that 20 years earlier the ship had what's known as a Tiger Cruise. This is when family members of sailors got to go out to sea with the ship for a day or two to see what ship life is like. Supposedly on this cruise, there was a young girl, the daughter of one of the officers. The scuttle in the Shaft Alley had been left open and the girl stepped into the hole and fell to her death. The ship was decommissioned in 2015 and sits inactive in Pearl Harbor now. I have no idea what any of this means, but it was definitely one of the weirdest things that has ever happened to me. Has anyone ever experienced anything like this while they were in the Navy or just in general? Back when I was in the Navy, I was doing my time as a mess crank. Everyone who enlists has to take their time and bust up their bones as a mess crank. This entails working for the cooks for a couple of months doing things like cleaning, vegetable prep, serving the chiefs and officers, and my favorite, the scullery. I love the scullery because all I had to do was scrub the dishes, clean the absolute crap out of the dish room, and go sleep in my rack, while everybody else was still slaving away. While I was cranking, there was another guy cranking too. His name was Leslie. I say was because he has since been sentenced to death, but we'll get to that later. Leslie was a stocky guy of Haitian descent, and the cooks were the white, nerdy type and were intimidated by Leslie, so whatever he refused to do fell upon me, as at the time, I was working in the dining room. Time went on and I got sick and tired of pulling his weight and working hard while he relaxed. I would ask him for help and he would just tell me to screw off, so I would put my heavy kitchen trash into his trash and ask him to help me with my trash, knowing he would say no. Then I'd watch him struggle to take out his trash and mine, not even knowing. Anyway, more days passed and I had enough of the cooks. They were too scared to ask him to do anything, so I confronted him and told him that he needs to do more, as I was tired of doing all the extra stuff. I told him that I liked him, but I was prepared to fight him. He declined, and we eventually became friends. And I got to know him as a nice guy with incredible intelligence. Fast forward some months and we are no longer cranking, but doing our regular jobs. One morning, I arrived at work and learned that Leslie had killed his wife, bludgeoned her sister, and stabbed himself several times in the throat. I also learned that he had a history of violence, and my mind immediately went back to the times that I played pranks on him and called him out for a fistfight. He was a tough-looking guy, but I had no idea that he was a killer. I look at his declining my invitation to a fight as him sparing my life. I'm not sure how creepy this is, but it definitely involves someone I would never want to meet again. Let's put it that way. After offering my account to the tribunal for the deaths of 4 soldiers, they didn't want to know anything about it. So, maybe you would like to read about it from someone who was actually there. This is a long read, but if you ever wanted to know about the brutality that actually occurred, then this is definitely worth reading. March 1996, I am the age of 16 and joined the British Army. When you join the armed forces in the UK, you start with 10 weeks of basic training, as I was just going to be an army chef. I attended the Pirbright training camp for what I thought would be the worst part of army training. I couldn't be more wrong. Now back then I was super fit and very happy-go-lucky. I took the training even though I was incredibly tough. There was horrible accommodation, bad food, and you ran rugged from 4 a.m. to 9 p.m. every single day. I got through and passed, but I still remember my passing out parade and how proud my mom was watching me in my uniform marching around. After you finish the hell out of boot camp, you go on to phase 2, which is your trade training, which depending on what you chose you wanted to be or where you went would be different. For me, as a chef, I was assigned to State Omer Barracks in Aldershot. However, until your phase 2 training started, everyone, no matter the trade, went to the Deep Cut Barracks. It was a delightful camp about 1 mile from Pirbright, so only down the road. Initially, I was very excited to be leaving basic training. After all, the food was better. You could have duvets on your bed and the regime was nowhere near as strict as Pirbright. When you first arrive, you were all put into a new arrivals building, sharing a room with 10 others until they decided that what platoon you went to. I assume on the length of time you would be there. So I settled in for the first night. I knew a few of my roommates from my training platoon. My very first night on the camp, I got a glimpse into the realities of what deep cut was. I woke up at around 1 a.m. because I needed to go to the bathroom. Upon getting to the door, before I could open it, 2 guys in gas masks carrying pillowcases barged into the room. They ran straight to the far bed and proceeded to batter a lad sleeping in the bed with what looked like an outline of helmets and pillowcases. After watching this stunned, I thought I should get help when I noticed the corporal who was in charge of us that night was holding the door open for the 2 guys. He looked hammered and was in hysterics that was unfolding. The assault lasted for probably 30 seconds before they ran out, followed by the corporal at the door, and I could hear them pissing themselves with laughter as they ran down the stairs. After helping the battered lad to the bathrooms, I watched him clean up himself. Neither of us said anything at all. He looked about my age, was probably about 16. What could we do if one of the people in charge was involved and behind this? In the next few days, I came to realize this camp was basically where sergeants, corporals, and officers went if they had failed in their career for punishment. What better people to look after 200 to 300 young impressionable soldiers, all between the ages of 16 to very early 20s. They got drunk and did things to us for their own amusement. I had the hope and knowledge it would be okay. You normally spend one night, at most 2 weeks there. I would be out of here soon. Day 3, I got called into the sergeant's office. He explained due to the fact that they were short on army chefs, no one wanted to be an heroic army chef, so they were critically short, I had to wait at Deep Cut for enough chefs to pass basic training before going on to my next phase. After asking how long, 3 months was the reply. 3 months at this hellhole. I thought it couldn't get any worse. I was very, very wrong. At this stage, I got introduced to my platoon while I was at Deep Cut. By my brand new platoon sergeant, I will refer to as Sergeant G. He initially sounded very friendly and spoke with a soft Sunderland accent. He started by laying down ground rules, cleaning, etc. It was at this point he warned us about the evil twin. We all laughed, but he wasn't joking. He said if we came across his twin, it wouldn't end well, and left us at that. After speaking to a few of the lads that had been there for a week or so, they reiterated the warning along with "Do not get on Sergeant G's radar, just keep your head down." It was at this point I began hearing rumors of the suicide of a soldier and the involvement of Sergeant G. Apparently, he had made this soldier the target of his evil twin and made his life an utter misery, tormenting him whenever he could. It was a few days after that I personally witnessed the evil twin in action. I and a few lads were in our room when a pigeon flew in through the open window. After several hilarious attempts to shoo the bird out, we failed and the pigeon carried on flying around and landing on lockers. This is when Sergeant G enters the room and asks what's going on. After explaining about the pigeon, he says, "I will show you how to catch him." He then proceeded to jump from the beds in the air to catch the bird. At first this was hilarious and we were all laughing, as was Sergeant G. That is until this went on for at least 30 minutes, maybe more. He just didn't stop, he was relentless. The poor pigeon was probably scared to death at this point and got himself caught by Sergeant G. Now what happened next I will always remember. Sergeant G put the pigeon's head in his mouth and bit it clean off. He then spat the head out onto one of the beds and threw the body out of the window. Stunned by this, we just stood there, while the demented Sergeant G kept saying Evil Ed's had his dinner. He was just laughing. While this was probably the most psychotic events I witnessed, the sheer cruelty of Sergeant G was legendary. One day in the height of summer, he made us push a huge temporary road around a field bare-handed. If you have ever seen a temporary road, it's basically a gigantic roll of rubber and steel. Being jet black and being in the sun all day, this thing was incredibly hot. It was so in fact, all of our palms and fingers turned into huge blisters on each hand. After inspecting the damage to our ravaged hands, he shouted at us for not having men's hands, even to the woman. Not satisfied with this, he ordered us to grab a huge rope from the back of the Land Rover and ordered us to tug of war with it as this rough strip of rope until the blisters all tore our hands to shreds. The pain of the raw flesh of our hands was incredibly hard to deal with, especially when he then ordered us to do press-ups on the hot concrete afterward. There was almost no time to even, recover. The booster injections they give everyone became infected in a few of us. Sergeant G's evil twin made it his mission to find who had an effective booster shot and would punch them in the spine as hard as he could. To this day, I still carry the scar after he exploded my infected injection. Of course, he made me do press-ups while the blood and pus poured down my arm. He would do things like that, hiding under beds like a real-life boogeyman, waiting to see everyone and see who would dare to talk about him or anything like that. It was boring, honestly. The man was a lunatic for sure. While at deep cut, time went slowly. All we had to do was whatever the delightful training staff would come up for us. One day, the LT in charge announced that we were going for an exercise for 2 nights and 3 days in the woods around Sandhurst. On the morning of the exercise, Sergeant G gathered everyone on the parade to get everyone organized and announced on the exercise some of his SAS mates might make an appearance and interrogate people during the exercise. I didn't think much on this, as he always was giving us unveiled threats. This exercise didn't actually start off that badly. The weather during the first day was gorgeous. It was very sunny, and for some reason, they didn't take this opportunity to do some running with the kit in the sun. The night settled into guard duty. To explain, you and your Basha mate, Basha is a hole dug in the ground for where you slept in, will take a stag duty, which lasts about an hour. The guard duty itself involves you lying down in a camouflaged hole dug especially for the guard duty. Then, one of you will go to the next Basha and tell them it's their turn, so on, so forth. At the end of our turn, I went to the next Basha and whispered it's their turn to stay on. A low voice that sounded like a Scottish accent came from the shelter, aggressively telling me to go away. I didn't recognize it at first, and thought to myself, maybe the SAS thing is true. Maybe I can be a hero and capture Sergeant G's mates. Imagining what Sergeant G's face would be in the morning if I reported that I single-handedly repelled the SAS attack. I cocked my SA-80 with a blank round and demanded whoever it was show themselves. Silence. Angrily, I pulled back the poncho covering the Basha to be greeted with what could only be seen as Sergeant G's naked body. He was in the Basha, shagging one of the female recruits, and must have put on a weird fake voice to throw me off. I stood stunned as a furious naked Sergeant G leaped to his feet, telling me not to say a word about this and to get back on guard duty. I couldn't quite see how angry he was because it was dark, but I could hear the fury in his voice. I now was on his radar. He was married, and I was now witnessing him having sex with some woman whilst on exercise. I knew he would have to do something about this. The next morning things seemed okay. Sergeant G didn't even acknowledge me, which suited me. The exercise carried on into the night, and the weather this night wasn't really like the night before. It was a torrential downpour, and I was assigned to the 3rd stag duty, which is around 1. I seem to recall. Weirdly, I was told that I had to stay on with the girl that Sergeant G was shagging, which was odd as it meant my Basha mate didn't have to do guard duty. I'm not sure why, but I wasn't suspicious about this sudden material above. We carried on with the guard duty, chatting in low voices, bored out of our minds as the rain hammered the waterproof material above. All of a sudden, I felt a tremendous weight crash through our canopy and right onto my back. Someone from behind grabbed me from my helmet, and then I could feel this knife against my throat. Pulling my helmet tighter, backward, it felt like someone was headbutting or hitting the back of my helmet with something. He demanded I drop my rifle in the same Scottish accent I heard the night before. Pulling me to my feet, he ushered me toward the dark forest. Glancing down, I thought I was going to die as I caught a glimpse of the girl I was on guard duty with, and to see how terrified she was when she locked eyes for a moment. Then she carried on laying down with her hands behind her helmet. I remember stumbling through the woods for probably 10 minutes in the pitch black when the voice ordered me to lie face down on the ground. Dropping down in what was a huge muddy puddle, I tried to keep my head and face above from the water so I didn't die from, suffocation, drowning, etc. The voice then demanded my name, rank, and number, which I gave him. He didn't believe me and said he would shove my head into the puddle, when I assumed was his foot. Daring to look back up slightly, I could see 2 pairs of boots, which I know must be Sergeant G and probably one of the corporals. The other one didn't speak at all. They then started asking about how many people were in our platoon, and who was in charge, etc., which obviously gave them all they wanted to know. Being 16 and terrified, being alone in the woods, what was I supposed to do? I knew it was Sergeant G, but I didn't want to make him angry. This, of course, had the opposite effect. He gave me what felt like a right kick in the freaking testicles, as hard as he could. The pain from this was excruciating. I felt like I wanted to throw up. Every instinct was to curl up in the fetal position, but they wouldn't allow me to. This carried on further for 20 to 25 minutes, with them asking things of how great Sergeant G was and other corporals in the platoon, to whom was the biggest slag in the platoon. No matter what I answered, it was met with violence like kicks to the ribs. My fingers trod on to the point where I felt thin stick whipping the back of my thighs, and thankfully they got bored and realized they couldn't carry on doing this without actually killing me. I was ordered to my feet and led back to the area of our platoon, and camped out and told to go ahead alone when fairly close. After retrieving my rifle from the girl who was still on stag duty alone, she asked what happened. I always remember this as I didn't want to seem like a coward, and I told her nothing had happened and they had just asked me questions. However, I was crying inside. All I wanted to do was go home to my mom, as pathetic as that sounds, but I just felt violated. The next morning was the end of the exercises. Sergeant G gathered everyone, after some debriefing mainly about how bad we had done before. He then announced that his mates from the SAS reported that they had interrogated a few people while staring at the whole time. The whole march back, all I could think was how he was going to get me now. Everyone knew what he was like, and without doubt, I would be targeted by him now. The misery was unbearable. I wanted the march to last longer because at least everyone was present so he couldn't single me out. We got back to the camp and everyone set about cleaning gear when I was told the officer wanted to see me. My heart leaped thinking the girl may have reported what happened. Would this be my savior in a way as it was? The officer informed me that there were enough people to form a training troop at State Omar, passing out to Purbright, so I would be leaving that week. Thankfully, I managed to avoid Sergeant G for the whole week, and I volunteered to set up the field for RLC Day, and was under the supervision of a different sergeant, thank God. So that's it, my epic tale of Deep Cut Barracks as mentioned at the start. I tried to let the tribunal know what occurred there, but they don't want to know. This man affected me in such a way that I still have reoccurring nightmares. I've rejoined the army and he is going to get his revenge. As for Sergeant G, don't worry about him. Boys and girls, he got his just desserts for all the years of torment he doled out to vulnerable young soldiers. The army recognized this and promoted him. He is now the officer in charge of recruit welfare in the British Army. This I wish was a lie, but it is not. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy these allegedly true, creepy experiences from people who are in the military, be sure to hit that like button as it helps me out a ton. If you're new to the swamp and you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to never miss a new video, as I upload them almost every single day, on all things natural and supernatural. If you have a story you would like to share in a future video, whether it has something to do with the military or not, be sure to send it in at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. I really enjoyed these stories personally. Some of these were pretty creepy. That last one was pretty long-winded, but honestly, that sounds like a really hard time to get through, and I don't know how you could take a butt whooping like that and then just go act like nothing happened. My heart goes out to them. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you all soon with another creepy video.
Folklore. The beliefs, traditions, and culture of the people. Passed on in the most part through the spoken word, folklore expresses our values, our shared ideas with others. It is both how we were and how we are. Without a record, our customs and traditions may become lost to us in the present, but under the surface, we still draw on them. We still know. It's time to recall our forgotten history and to record the new. This is the Folklore Podcast.
shoes, bottles, coins. At first glance, these objects don't seem to have much in common. But these, and many other objects, are all items which have been found concealed within the fabric of old buildings during renovations or other work. In some cases, we know a little history behind the reasons for concealing these objects. Methods for constructing a witch bottle for protection against witches in your home are well recorded, for example. A glass bottle containing hair, nail clippings, iron nails, urine and the like might be placed in a window, up a chimney, or at some other liminal boundary position. The explanations and folklore behind some other concealments are not as well recorded, and so we need to indulge in a little more speculation when examining these finds. It is easy to suggest that all of the items discovered were originally concealed for protection. But is this really the case? Were some placed there for sentimental reasons, or for some other purpose? I'm Mark Norman. I'm a folklore researcher and author. Joining me on this episode of the Folklore Podcast to discuss her work with this subject is Dr. Kerry Holbrook. Kerry is a historical ethnographer and archaeologist with a particular interest in the material culture of popular customs and beliefs. She currently holds a postdoctoral research position on a project at the University of Hertfordshire, Inner Lives, Emotions, Identity and the Supernatural, 1300 to 1900. Kerry works with Professor Owen Davis on the Concealed Revealed, a project strand aiming to survey concealed deposits across the UK and beyond. What makes the examination of the folklore within this project interesting is the oblique approach it takes by engaging with the contemporary finders of the objects and talking to them about their feelings surrounding their find. The ways that these people engage with their finds help to extend the stories of those objects by shedding light on the continuing relationship between them and their custodians, as well as our own ideas on magic and the supernatural. Kerry, maybe we can begin by looking at the Concealed Revealed project itself. Could you tell us a little about how the project came about, what it's about, and what its aims are?
Okay, so back in October, so that's October 2015, we started work on the Inner Lives project, which is a collaborative project between University of Hertfordshire, University of East Anglia and UCL, with Malcolm Gaskell as the principal investigator. And they got Leverhulme funding to work on a project about identity, emotions and the supernatural from 1300 to 1900. And Owen Davies, a lecturer in history at Hertfordshire, he's taking charge of the years 1700 to 1900, and I'm his research assistant. So we're looking at kind of anything to do with emotions and the supernatural between the years 1700 to 1900. But I'm particularly interested in looking at concealed deposits, so how people, what they feared, how they kind of harnessed the supernatural to combat those fears, how they protected their homes. So we're really interested in looking at kind of personal spaces, what was considered the most vulnerable. So, you know, the chimney, the doorway, the windows, the malevolent threats that could get through them. So witches, demons, the devil, ghosts, fairies, and how people protected those spaces, kind of fighting magic with magic. And the Concealed Revealed is looking at the concealed deposit, so anything from concealed shoes. I think Northampton Shoe Museum have got records of about 2,000 concealed shoes having been recorded, but there's more added weekly. Concealed garments, so any type of clothing, and then quite odd items like crockery, mummified cats, mummified rats, horse skulls, just a kind of very random, eclectic collection of objects that people chose to just conceal in unusual locations within the domestic space, places where they can't have been accidentally lost. And because nothing's written about them from those years, we don't know why they were put there. So that they were there to protect the house is just one theory amongst many. And there probably isn't one size fits all. It probably wasn't that all concealed shoes were concealed to protect the house. It's probably that one concealed shoe might have been, the other one might not have been. But concealed revealed is taking a slightly different approach by looking more at the contemporary finders rather than the historic concealers. So asking questions like, how do people find these deliberately concealed objects? What do they think when they find them? Why don't they just throw them away? A lot of people feel very strongly about them. People who claim to not be the least bit superstitious, to not believe in magic, or the preternatural power of what they've found, are still very reluctant to let them leave the house, or even to let them leave kind of the close vicinity of where they were found. So you'll find that a lot of concealed shoes, when they're found, people want them on display, they're proud of them, they want to show them off, but at the same time they want to keep them close to where they were found. So if they were found at the chimney breast, they'll place them on a shelf over the fireplace. So that's what we're really interested in looking at.
What have you learned so far from the people that have found these objects about how they react with them in modern times and about how they feel about them?
It's very strange, really, because so many people, they'll start their speech, their conversation by, I'm not superstitious. So they want to get that out there. That's kind of the disclaimer. But then they'll go on to describe quite, I don't like the word superstitious, but they're explaining how attached they are to these objects, which really they've not had anything to do with. They've never used them. They've never seen them before. Really, they're just old, grubby shoes or a mummified rat. Something that if you just saw it lying on the street, you wouldn't feel any kind of connection to. But the fact that these people find them in their homes and they think that they were deliberately concealed by a past resident of the house, it makes them feel connected both to the object and to the past resident. So there's some kind of like enchained relationships kind of being fostered by these objects. There's a definite feeling that the objects belong to the house. So even if the person doesn't feel any superstition towards them, the object shouldn't leave the house because it's part of the house. So in a lot of cases, if people have found a concealed deposit and they move, they won't take it with them. They'll leave it in the house. They'll either reconceal it or they'll tell the new owner about it. So yeah, a lot of strange emotions, definite excitement and pride, but also sometimes fear, fear about what would happen if the object left the house. So yeah.
What objects have you turned up so far on your researches?
A lot of shoes. They're my personal favourite. A small wooden figurine from Burwash. We call it the Burwash figure, and it's quite crudely made. It's very, very small, probably just over a centimetre, maybe 2 centimetres, and it kind of looks like a pregnant woman lying on her back. So possible fertility magic, or possibly just a child's toy that ended up being secreted away or accidentally lost. But that's a special little find. We're hoping to 3D scan it, and then we can get that online. What else? Skeletons of cats underneath hearthstones. One was in Cumbria, and they laid it back underneath the hearthstone. Clay pipes were found up a chimney breast, alongside another shoe. A pair of trousers were found hidden up in a roof void in the banqueting house at Whitehall in London. That was found about a month ago.
What about witch bottles? Have they turned up, or are they classed as something different?
I am cataloguing them, but we don't use the term witch bottle. Well, I started to, but we decided against it because only some of them are connected with witchcraft. Witch bottles are unusual because they are one of the few concealed deposits where there is kind of written sources that tell us what they were there for. So we do know that people were using them to repel witchcraft. But then there are other bottles that were used as kind of love charms, other bottles that were used to just cure ailments, had nothing to do with witchcraft. So we do have a category of concealed bottles, and they range in date from kind of the 1500s to, there's one at the Museum of London in their stores, which is a little brown plastic medicine bottle. You'll know the kind of, if you see it, it's very modern. And that was found in the Thames with a tiny little bottle of oil of clove, 2 coins. I can't remember when they were dated to, but I think 1980s, and about 40 human teeth. So that was found washed up on the Thames. So, I mean, do we class that as a witch bottle? It's definitely something going on about probably sympathetic magic. Did the person have toothache? Because oil of clove was used for toothache as well. So maybe, and were the coins a kind of payment for the cure? I don't know. But yeah, fascinating. And what I love about bottles is that you get a vessel and you get it concealed, but for completely different purposes, completely different reasons, and you can trace them over the years. So you get the classic kind of Bellarmine jugs or Bartman jugs, with the classic nails, pins, urine, maybe placed under a hearthstone or under a threshold, and that's to repel a witch's curse. And then, go to the 1980s and you're getting a plastic medicine bottle tossed into the Thames with teeth in. So yeah, it's nice to watch it kind of how the custom adapts to fit different people's needs in different times.
What's the oldest and the most modern that you've come across?
I couldn't tell you the oldest, because I'm mainly working on from 1700 onwards. So, I mean, the Bellarmines, they must date back quite far. Sadly, we've not had any being found while I've been working on the project. Or, well, I've not heard about it. It would be great if we did. I do scour Twitter looking for references to people having found bottles, and there was one woman who found a bottle in her roof space and opened it, and everyone was saying, why would you open it? You're casting evil spirits onto your house. But I think she was in America. I think that was a fairly modern bottle.
Now, prior to this research, you've looked at other kinds of deposits and assemblages. Can you tell me a little bit about your earlier research?
Well, I did my PhD at Manchester University on coin trees. I guess if you don't know what a coin tree is, it's just a tree with coins embedded into its bark, usually logs, sometimes stumps, sometimes living trees. And the custom comes from, well, the earliest example I've come across is in Scotland, in Isle Marie, in the Northwest Highlands. And the earliest reference to a tree being used as some kind of altar on that island comes from 1775, I think. And at the time there was a holy well next to the tree, and people would go to the holy well for cures to insanity. And then they would leave their offering by either throwing a coin into the well or placing it on the tree next to it. And over time, the coins became more about wishes, offerings to the saint, rather than as a cure. And then the custom seemed to spread. So you get a few examples in Ireland, one more in Scotland that I know of. And then it seemed to kind of hit England in the 1990s, for some reason, it just sprung up. I'm not sure which the earliest one is, possibly in Yorkshire, but for some reason it just exploded, and spread all throughout the country, all throughout England, Wales, a few modern ones in Scotland, and people today are still hammering their coins into these trees, more akin to tossing a coin into a fountain. So for making wishes or for good luck, future fortune, although a lot of people will admit to just doing it because other people have done it or to keep their kids happy. So that's what I did my PhD on. Now I'm really interested in love locks. So padlocks attached to rails, usually over bridges. And the tradition is that you go there as a couple, you deposit your love lock, and then as a gesture of your eternal commitment to each other, you toss your key into the river below. And you're not meant to be able to break up unless you fish the key out of the river and unlock the love lock. Although today, I have seen a few cases where people have just Tipp-X'd out their names on the love lock, as an easier, more modern way of, kind of nullifying the deposit. But yeah, they've exploded as well, even more so than the coin trees, because I really don't think you can go to a large city in Europe and not come across, a love lock assemblage, because everywhere I go, I'm seeing them. They're all over the place.
Where did that custom start? Is it known?
It's really not known. Different places are claiming it as their own. So there's a place in Hungary, a place in Romania, Serbia. They're claiming that their town started it, and some of them have got kind of origin stories. So back in World War I, there was a soldier and he left his beloved, and so these kind of folk stories that possibly do date back to World War I, possibly date to the last 5 years. There is an argument that the actual custom comes from China, and maybe it does, but in terms of the contemporary resurgence, probably didn't get big until it appeared in a novel. I can't remember the name of the author, but it was Italian, and it was called I Want You, although I don't know the Italian name for it. And in it, two teenagers who've fallen in love, one of them attaches a padlock to a bridge in Rome, and since then it kind of spread. Didn't get really big until it hit Paris, and then there was the whole issue of kind of the bridge collapsing under the weight, and the removal of the love locks, and there was a petition going around like no more love locks, which is still quite strong today. And it is interesting how different cities and different towns react to it. So some of them are really against it, and try their best to discourage it. In Florence, it's actually a finable offence to deposit a love lock. Other places encourage it. They want to attract the tourists. They want to kind of celebrate this custom, like Bakewell in England. They sell love locks by the love lock bridge, quite shamelessly. Quite happy for people to go there and attach their love locks to the bridge because it makes it an interesting sight. So yeah.
Other than love locks and coin trees, do you find that other random assemblages spring up in odd places?
Coins are the most obvious, because people will always have coins on them. So tossing them into fountains or placing them on a grave. So they're all over the country, probably all over the world. Then there are places where you're going to get a lot of ribbons tied to trees, rags, jewellery. They do tend to be in places of significance for some reason, either spiritual, historical. I'm trying to think of what the strangest one is. I mean, there are places where there are toys, teddy bears and dolls tied to trees. I don't know where it is, but there's that place, the little fairy woods, where people are leaving little fairy doors all over the trees. I guess leave enough and it'll just spiral from there. or those places where you go into like a bar and people have left notes, currency, but in different, from different countries. So you have a wall just covered in currency from all over the world. Seriously, wherever you go, there will be some form of assemblage. And it's impossible to find out how it started and why it started. And you can speak to the people who are leaving the deposits, but their answer will be, well, I'm doing it to add my own, to add it to the assemblage. They want to leave their mark. In most cases, they won't have any idea what it was for.
You're interested in hearing from people who've found concealed objects. How can people find out more about your project and how to get in touch with you?
Well, we've got a blog. So that's theconcealedreveal.wordpress.com. And on that is my email, but my email also is c.holbrook, HOULBROOK, @gmail.com. And Twitter @concealreveal or #concealreveal. I've also got a Facebook page, The Concealed Revealed. So any form of that. We're trying to pin the locations of these concealed deposits on History Pin. So we've got the Concealed Reveal collection on History Pin, where anyone, as long as you've got an account is free and it's easy to sign up, you can just go on and pin your own find. So a photograph of it, whatever information you've got about it, no matter how little, you just pin it where it was found in the world. And we're hoping to get a kind of a global view. The earthquake that struck Christchurch in New Zealand left a lot of buildings kind of half destroyed. So they've had to demolish a lot, and this archaeology firm have gone in to kind of deal with the rubble, see what they can find, and they found a lot of concealed deposits. Some of them are clearly more time capsules, but we're equally interested in those. So they're going to go onto History Pin and start pinning their finds, and that would be brilliant because really don't know much about the custom in New Zealand. So that would be great. But I guess what we do want to make clear is that we're not exclusive at all about what we're looking for. It doesn't have to be an obviously protective object. It doesn't even have to have obviously been deliberately concealed. It just has to have been found in a strange place in a building for us to be interested. So it could have been an accidental loss. It could have been intended more as a time capsule. It might be something that was just shoved in there as a joke. Maybe the builders left something of their own there when they renovated or built something. Just anything. We're just interested in how people interpret them and what they feel about finding odd things in their houses.
If people are interested in seeing these sorts of concealed objects, can you recommend places that exhibit these sorts of finds?
Well, sadly, a lot of places, even though they have concealed deposits as part of their collections, they don't tend to be on display. They tend to be more in store. So to see them, you might have to contact the curator, but they're always happy to show you. Places where they're actually on display, there are a few concealed shoes on display in Northampton Museum. They're going to be undergoing some kind of big development restoration, and they're hoping to get concealed shoes kind of a more prominent place in the exhibition. So hopefully soon there will be a good display of concealed shoes. Then there's the Museum of Witchcraft in Boscastle in Cornwall, which is interesting because a lot of the people I've spoken to have said that they had no idea when they found odd concealed deposits in their homes, the significance of it, until they went to the Museum of Witchcraft. So this seems to be more than the internet, more than books. Museums seem to be the place where people get their information, where they realize that that shoe they found up the chimney is more than just a shoe. It was intended for something. It was probably put there on purpose. So yeah, Museum of Witchcraft is probably the best place to go for information about concealed deposits.
My thanks to Dr. Kerry Holbrook for a fascinating introduction to some of the stories behind these concealed objects and their discoveries. Kerry's biography can be found on the guests page on the Folklore Podcast website, where there are links to contact her. Each episode of the Folklore Podcast is supported with an episode supplement containing not only a show transcript, but a wealth of additional information and suggested reading. Each supplement is presented as an electronic magazine, beautifully designed by Melissa Martell at MDM Creative, and costs just 99p, or just over $1. It's a tiny amount, but it helps to cover the costs of producing this show. This episode supplement contains additional concealed object finds and a gallery of photos of found items, links to video interviews, and more. Get yours by visiting our website at www.thefolklorepodcast.com. While you're on the website, click on our contact page and subscribe for our free monthly newsletter to receive exclusive news about future episodes, special offers and more. Reviews are vital to us. Your feedback at Facebook and Twitter so far has been stunning, and we are humbled by it. Please also rate us on iTunes, as that's the place where we really get noticed. Some of you have asked about support for the show. Well, the Folklore Podcast will always be free to listen to, but if you want to support our running costs, it's not free for us to produce, then that's a wonderful gesture. There's absolutely no pressure, but to facilitate this for you, I've added a donate button to the website. No suggested amounts, no questions, just a button. Thank you for your continued support, and thanks for listening. Join me next episode, where I'll be discussing links between black dog apparitions and the wild hunt. See you next time.
Folklore. The beliefs, traditions and culture of the people. Passed on in the most part through the spoken word, folklore expresses our values, our shared ideas with others. It is both how we were and how we are. Without a record, our customs and traditions may become lost to us in the present, but under the surface, we still draw on them. We still know. It's time to recall our forgotten history and to record the new. This is the Folklore Podcast.
When the winter winds blow and the Yule fires are lit, it is best to stay indoors, safely shut away from the dark paths and the wild heaths. Those who wander out by themselves during the Yule nights may hear a sudden rustling through the tops of the trees, a rustling that might be the wind, though the rest of the wood is still. But then the barking of dogs fills the air, and the host of wild souls sweeps down, fire flashing from the eyes of the black hounds and the hooves of the black horses. Those atmospheric words were written by Kveldulf Gunderson, a non-fiction writer specialising in Germanic mythology and paganism, and describe the danger of straying out at times when the wild hunt was said to ride abroad. Gunderson, in fact, is a nom de plume of American author Stephen Grundy, who under his own name writes modern adaptations of legendary sagas. I'm Mark Norman. I'm a folklore researcher and author. I am interested in the broad field of folklore, but there are some areas in which I concentrate my work. My particular area of research specialism is in black dog folklore, ghostly apparitions of black dogs that haunt the landscape. If you are not familiar with the motif, then think of The Hound of the Baskervilles, the Sherlock Holmes story by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, as a starting point. But then, keep listening to find out much more. I hold what is thought to be the UK's largest archive of eyewitness accounts, legends and traditions about the black dog. I'm also the author of a book, Black Dog Folklore, which is the first full-length study of the subject by an individual author. In this episode of the Folklore Podcast, I'll draw on all of this to examine links in folklore between these phantom dogs and the legend of the Wild Hunt. The Wild Hunt, or possibly the Raging Host, or other titles, is a piece of folk mythology well known across much of Europe, although its form varies slightly in each of the geographical areas in which it is found. In spite of these regional differences, the fundamental aspects of the myth remain the same, that of a group of phantom huntsmen, on horses and accompanied by hounds, rampaging across the land or the sky in pursuit of quarry. In some aspects, the hunt may be made up of the dead, in others fairies, and the pack may also be accompanied by demons. The leader of the pack again varies based on local tradition, or by local character. In all cases, to see the hunt can foretell some form of disaster, and will usually lead to the death of the witness, if they do not follow some prescribed manner of avoiding the sight. The root of the Wild Hunt myth most likely lies with the Teutonic god Woden, Odin in the Norse. As the god of the wind, he was said to ride through the skies on his 8-legged steed, Sleipnir. Because at one time it was believed that the souls of the dead were carried away on the winds of a storm, Odin became the leader of spirits. He would ride out to gather the dead, and so, at times of a storm, he began to develop an association with the weather. From here, the presaging of death or misfortune was added to the legend. As I've just noted, the mythology was adopted and developed on a regional basis across the geographical areas of Europe, and with this different characters were installed as the leader of the hunt, such as King Arthur or Charlemagne in the Middle Ages. It is, of course, a natural step to introduce the demonic elements, and in some cases to include the devil himself as the head of the pack. Indeed, as with all things, Christian influences would later be applied to the mythology, meaning that the hunt became adopted as a motif for the devil, hunting out the souls of evil sinners, or unbaptized children. Apparitions of ghostly black dogs have been a part of folklore for nearly a millennia now, but yet they are often overlooked and seldom studied with any seriousness. They are seen all over the world, but are far more common in the United Kingdom. Many people, in point of fact, know little if anything about the folklore of the black dog, despite this long time frame. The dog is unique in folklore terms. All domesticated animals functioned as an extension of man, and many still do to a lesser extent. In ancient times they supplied hides for warmth or protection. They gave food for strength or to prolong life. Bones were used as weapons or tools, and horns provided a more varied voice before the natural one was developed. In later development, cats killed the vermin which evaded human capture, and horses lent speed and strength for journeys, or in times of war. But the dog is somewhat different. The dog was certainly domesticated as far back as the Mesolithic times, and there is evidence which suggests that in fact they were kept as pets even in the Upper Paleolithic. Of all the creature companions, it is the canine that has associated itself with mankind from the earliest possible times. He may be considered man's best friend, emerging from the primeval forest as a fellow huntsman. The dog contributed speed and cunning to the chase, and his bite to the battle. It is easy to see how the symbol would become part of the wild hunt tradition. Dog ghosts appear to have been seen, as I've already noted, all over the world. The interpretation of them, of course, depends on the religious views of each community. And some hold the dog to be unclean, others see them as part of the family. Phantom dogs are common in Europe, and, following on from that, wherever there are European settlers in other continents. In Britain, ghostly black dog apparitions may be divided into two main types. The first of these is the true black dog, which is usually just like any other large dog to look at. And secondly, there is the Barghest type. The Barghest appears in various shapes, but generally that of a dog. It is dangerous and ominous to meet it, especially head-on, and in this way it has parallels with the ghostly pack which accompanies the wild hunt. The Barghest type of dog is particularly prevalent in wide areas of East Anglia and in the north of England, from Cumberland down to the Yorkshire Dales, as far south as the Peak District. There are some overlaps between the traits of these two types of ghostly dog, but for the most part we can consider them as separate genera, to borrow a scientific term from their living counterparts. There is a popular superstitious conception that all black dogs are an omen of death, but collating all the reports and traditions shows that at least half of them are harmless. Whereas the Barghest type of dog, or the shook as it's called in East Anglia, is invariably horrific in some way, the black dog is either neutral or friendly and protective. It should be considered the case, therefore, that it is the Barghest type of black dog apparition which is linked with the wild hunt. In Protestant Germany and Scandinavia, the ghost dog is nearly always diabolic. In the former case, for example, the devil is said to appear in the form of a black dog. This motif goes back many centuries, and indeed in the United Kingdom, the earliest reference which we can find which links the symbolism of the black dog with that of the wild hunt is from the 12th century. This comes from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the earliest known history of England written in the native tongue. The document was probably first compiled for King Alfred before being sent to monasteries across Britain for copying around 829 AD. Its first version spanned the period from the birth of Christ to Alfred's reign and comprised an official history of the country, but the individual copies were then kept updated in each location and began to take on more independent histories. Most versions end around the Norman conquest of 1066, but one continues until 1154, and it is in this version that we find the mention of the dog. Many writers quote a common translation of this passage, which reads that, "Many men both saw and heard a great number of huntsmen hunting. The huntsmen were black, huge and hideous, and rode on black horses and on black he-goats, and their hounds were jet black, with eyes like saucers, and horrible." Even in this very early mention, we find a reference to the size of the eyes. This is interesting, as it's one of the key recurring themes in reports of black dog ghosts. The eyes are very often described as being as big as saucers, or as big as dinner plates. In older reports, they are sometimes referred to as red. In newer reports, they are often referred to as yellow. And this is probably one of those cultural shifts which can happen within folklore when you consider that symbols are read alongside the comparators of the time. If the dog was considered diabolic, then red would be a natural colour. In more recent times, it would be culturally more common to compare with, for example, the image of the werewolf, and hence the wolf, and this would lead to more reports of yellow eyes. There is also, it's worth noting, an interesting etymological problem with this translation of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle referencing the eyes like saucers, and that is that the word saucer derives from the 14th century, and hence cannot be a direct translation from the original document. The correct translation, in fact, reads that the hounds were black and big-eyed and loathsome. The meaning carries through, with the later recurring description having been juxtaposed onto the original translation, highlighting again its significance. Unfortunately, most writers still tend to quote the mistranslated version. This regional variation of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle comes from Peterborough, and it is thought that the appearance of the wild hunt in this case coincided with the appointment of a particular abbot at the monastery, Henry d'Angely, who turned out to be a poor choice. The passage continues to tell how the hunt was seen in the deer park at Peterborough, and in the woods that stretch from there to the nearby town of Stamford. In the night, the monks were said to be able to hear the huntsmen sounding their horns. Witnesses described as reliable, though we do not know who they were, said that the hunt numbered 20 or 30, and that the disturbances went on for 9 weeks, ending at Easter. Although now designated as being part of the county of Cambridgeshire, up until 1888, Peterborough sat with the boundaries of Northamptonshire, which puts it close to the Barguest and Shook areas, which have the most relevance to the inclusion of elemental black dogs within the wild hunt. The Barguest type of black dog apparition is not one that would be mistaken for a normal animal, as it's always monstrous in some way. In East Anglia, the Shook is generally a black dog haunting cliffs, fens and churchyards. The name is possibly derived from the Anglo-Saxon Shioka, meaning devil. Descriptions of the way that the Shook or Barguest appear monstrous vary between accounts. It's sometimes said to appear headless, or on other occasions with one eye in the middle of its forehead. In some areas it is said to appear in the form of other animals, such as a calf or a horse, and in Norfolk, sometimes as a goat. Another variation on the Shook and Barguest type of black dog is the padfoot. This is a term that has no doubt become more familiar since J.K. Rowling adopted it as a nickname for her character Sirius Black in the Harry Potter series of stories. Black, for those who have not read the books, was able to transform himself into a black dog. Rowling uses a lot of folklore interwoven into her stories, and it will not be too difficult to also see the connection between Sirius, the dog star, and Black as a surname also in this case. Many Midland Celtic names derived from the Gaelic rather than the Welsh. W.P. Whitcutt, referring to some of the Gaelic place names found in Staffordshire, believed that the term padfoot could derive from badafwath, meaning ghost dog. However, this may be disputed, as the padfoot may be found in several places in Yorkshire also, such as in the case of the Padfoot of Wakefield. This took many guises, and shows why ghost dog may not be such a suitable derivation for the name. At Westgate, it was reported to appear to be twice the size of a calf, one of the most common sizing descriptions, but was also said to have twisted spiral horns protruding from the front of its head, certainly not a common canine description. The eyes, as we see so often, were said to fit the standard description of being as big as saucers, but in this case the coat was described as being shaggy, like a bear. The creature roamed the streets with an iron chain clanking where it was secured around one leg. It was pursued by a large pack of Gabriel's hounds. Anyone who saw this animal was said to have thought that they should have died. The last of the reports of this legendary padfoot was recorded in the year 1766. Gabriel's hounds are a local derivation for the familiar image of the wild hunt, and it is interesting that in this case the wild hunt appears to be chasing another dog rather than a human witness or quarry. In this case, Gabriel does not refer to the archangel of that name, but rather comes from an old word for corpse. We find the term Gabriel's hounds in some places in the southwest of the United Kingdom also. Right at the beginning of this podcast, I suggested that the Norse mythology surrounding Odin was a probable route for the image of the wild hunt. It has been argued that the geographical location of many Shuk areas means that the folklore of this dog, and its associated demeanour of being more evil than many of the other types of black dog, is due to settlement by the Scandinavians. The premise is that the virulence of the Vikings is responsible for much of the legendary aspects of the Shuk. Danes invaded in AD 869 and murdered the Angle king Edmund, proceeding to destroy the Angle monasteries. In 1014, Guthrum was appointed Norse king in East Anglia, and it has been suggested that there is a relevance in the fact that his nickname was the Great Black Dog of Langport. In this theory, links are drawn between many black dogs being connected to water and the Viking association with the seas and oceans. It also examines the Anglo-Saxon Old English language and suggests that the Vikings and dogs may become confused in translation. For example, the Old English word for dog is hund, which is said to be a Saxon term of abuse applied to the Vikings. Similarly, it is argued, the term wolf could mean both wolf and a cruel person, and therefore it can be extrapolated that as wolf and dog are interchangeable in Old English, the Vikings would have been referred to as wolves or dogs. They were also known as wolves of slaughter, and wore wolf coats in battle, as well as allegedly breeding large war dogs. It is also suggested that elements of Scandinavian dog lore would have entered the folklore of Britain at the time, such as the fact that the king of the Norse gods, Odin, kept 2 dogs, whose names meant greedy for the flesh of the dead. The name Shuk, as we have seen, is probably derived from the Old English term for the devil, and the Norse god Thor also had a dog named Shukra. So the argument runs, but on closer inspection it really seems to be something of a red herring. Linguistic roots inevitably go way back, and there is probably little connection between Shuk and Shukra in other terms. There is little evidence that the Vikings entered into the British consciousness in such a way that over the following hundreds of years the folklore developed in this way. It is more likely that the Vikings led to more of a subconscious fear of the werewolf than the dog. The wolf is far more threatening as an animal. We have already noted the domesticated traits of the dog going way back to prehistoric times, and its role in human nature, and it cannot realistically be argued that these are interchangeable with the wolf. As far as the Old English language arguments go, these also appear to be flawed. A wolf was a term that called for respect, whether this was for good doings or bad, and for this reason it was included in many Anglo-Saxon names, such as Beowulf. This would not have happened if it were a pure term of abuse. Hund, on the other hand, was a rather more severe term, and actually suggested that the person was lower than a slave. This would apply in the Anglo-Saxon community as well, not just be directed at the Vikings. So the bones of this theory can largely be discounted. So if it is unlikely that the Shuk variant of the black dog, which is the most relevant type for connecting to the wild hunt, has its roots from within Scandinavian history in this way, what other connections can we find between this motif and the wild hunt? The black dog often acts within some form of liminal or boundary state. Sometimes this is in the form of dogs that are connected to particular runs or stretches of road, sometimes as some form of guardian, and sometimes in connection to dream states. If we consider any of these boundary states as being a connection between our physical world and some other world in folklore terms, then we can also consider the black dog in these states as having the appearance of coming from the next world. This is certainly true of those stories and sightings where the dog is considered as some form of hellhound. There is a real mythological link in these cases, and as such, in normal terms of symbolism, this would suggest that the dog somehow came from the sky or from the earth. Appearances such as these can be presaged by, or accompanied by, particular meteorological or geological conditions, such as storms or, in rarer cases, earthquakes. So, we can find a link here with the stormy conditions which accompany the wild hunt. With the idea of links to the weather, then mythologies inevitably form around particular outstanding natural events. The great storm of Widdicombe-in-the-Moor on Dartmoor in 1638, where the church was struck by lightning, bringing down a pinnacle from the church tower, led to the development of the mythology surrounding the devil having visited the church and his horse having either been tethered to or hitting the church as it flew across the sky, having claimed a soul from the congregation. A similar freak storm hit the church of Bungay in the market town of Suffolk, and a similar mythology developed around this event, only this time concerning the black dog. The story is probably one of the most famous in the black dog canon. There can be no doubt that at both Widdicombe and in Suffolk, these storms were real events. The legend and lore has been mapped on in what were far more superstitious times than those we live in now. It would be quite natural to equate some form of demonic intervention with such a catastrophe in a holy place. The church records that still exist certainly describe the storm, and they do not mention the dog ghost. This establishing of a canine connection with storms is not unique in folklore. In some parts of America, dogs were said to be considered to be conductors of lightning. This is especially the case if the animal is wet, and particularly with reference to the dog's tail. Some people are known to have driven their dogs from a property during a thunderstorm in order to protect from a strike. Other animals in folklore who exhibit similar characteristics are horses and mules. Their eyes are said to attract lightning. In terms of addressing the landscape in which the black dog is appearing, we can consider the black dog of Bungay, for example, to be a sky dog, this being the obvious origination point for a storm. So here we may find another link with the wild hunt. In Teutonic lands, the wild hunt was often abroad during the 12 days of Christmas. This period, when the sun is at its weakest in the northern hemisphere, represented a time of crisis to primitive man. It was a time when life failed and elemental chaos rose from the surface of the earth. For 12 days, monsters and ghosts roamed the earth. In some cultures, a different animal was dominant each day. In Guernsey, there was a tradition that people travelling at this time were likely to fall foul of will-o'-the-wisps and black dogs. Other countries had their own demons or monsters which were abroad during this period. In an effort to overcome these happenings before the return of the sun, fires would be lit, greenery brought into the house, and people would guise the spirits to make light of their fears and of the creatures. These things lie behind some of the pagan aspects of Christmas, and were quashed by the church in medieval times. Remnants did remain, and appeared in a watered-down form as hobby horses, hobby goats, or stags, and even in one case as a hobby dog, accompanied by a man with a stick. Sometimes, as the Teutonic hunt passed through a house on its dreadful route, it was said to leave behind on the hearth a little dog, which howled until it woke up the whole household. The people then had to get up and brew some beer in eggshells, whereupon the creature would exclaim, "Although I am as old as the Bohemian forest, I never saw such a thing in my life before." Then it would jump up, rush off, and vanish. But if this charm was not applied, the people of the house were obliged to feed the creature well and let it lie upon the hearth for a whole year, until Woad returned and took it away with him. Should we consider that this old tradition has some connection with the leaving of a glass of whisky and a carrot by the chimney on Christmas Eve? Are we prepared to take the risk to ignore this tradition and end up with a fat bearded man and a reindeer bedding down in our fireplace for the next 12 months? Most wild hunts, according to tradition, appear to ride abroad on stormy nights. However, there appear to be very few black dogs which either forecast storms or cause them. In terms of folklore, there is little distinction between these two things. The most well known is obviously the Black Dog of Bungay, but it takes quite in-depth research to find many more examples. Marie Lamont, in 1662, said that the devil in the guise of a brown dog helped her to raise a storm. Lamont, who was 18 years old at the time, was tried as a witch in the Scottish parish of Inverkip, which was known for its zealous persecution of women as witches in the second half of the 17th century. We've already noted that there are various different characters who are said to be leaders of the wild hunt, depending on the geographic location of the tradition. Over time, the myth of the hunt gets modified so that it begins to incorporate local or newer gods and folk heroes. For example, King Arthur is now one of the cited leaders of the hunt. In Somerset, an old lane close to Cadbury Castle was called King Arthur's Lane, and as recently as the 19th century, it was still said that the king and his pack of dogs could be heard riding along it on stormy nights in the winter. In Devon, there has more recently been the inclusion of Sir Francis Drake as a hunt leader through Dartmoor folk tales. In some cases, the premise of the hunt is to chase down sinners or the unbaptized, this being mapped onto the tradition by the church. In Devon, in these cases, we find the Yeth Hounds, or Wisht Hounds, and in Cornwall, Dando and his dogs, or the Devil and his dandy dogs. In this version, Dando wanted a drink, but the huntsman, having no more, said he would go to hell for it. A stranger appeared shortly afterwards and offered Dando a drink. He then subsequently took Dando's game, followed by himself. His dogs set out in pursuit. We can also sometimes find in the southwest of the UK cases of the wild hunt being linked to notorious or evil characters. For instance, Squire Richard Cable lived at Brook, near to Buckfast Lee, where he died in 1677. Local tradition credits him with a reputation not unlike that of Black Hugo in The Hound of the Baskervilles, although there are no details given specifically as to his crimes. His death was said to be suitably unpleasant for a hunter of village maidens. He was chased across the moor by the Wisht Hounds until he dropped dead in one version of the story. In another version, it is said that as he lay dying in his house, Wisht Hounds bayed outside, having come to escort his soul to hell. It is possible that the story of Cable is one of the tales which contributed to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's forming of the Baskerville story. The remains of Buckfast Lee Church, which was almost completely destroyed by fire in an act of vandalism in July 1992, are perched on the top of the hill overlooking the village. It is here that Squire Cable is buried outside the south door in an altar tomb. It is said that the parish were in a quandary about how to bury such an evil man in such a manner that his brutal spirit would not rise up and continue to plague them. Finally, they buried him deeply with a heavy stone on his head. They piled the large altar tomb over his grave, and then constructed what appears to be a symbolic prison to contain the tomb. It is solidly built, with a wide iron grille on the side facing the church, and on the opposite side is a strong wooden door with a locked keyhole. Young boys used to dare each other to walk clockwise around the building 13 times and insert a little finger into the keyhole, which the prisoner would then gnaw at the tip. Despite all of these precautions, it was still said that on stormy nights the squire would rise up and join the wild hunt on their pursuit through the skies. If, like me, you are fascinated by the folklore surrounding black dog apparitions, then as always there is a supplementary e-magazine available to support this episode. This contains not only a transcript of the episode, but more information on black dog apparitions, notes, and suggested reading, and beautiful illustrations. Many hours of work go into these supplements, yet they are available for just 99p, or just over $1. We do this because we believe that this folklore should be made accessible to everyone as widely as possible, and the minimal charge just helps us to cover our costs and keep this show free to listen to. You can download the magazine from our website at www.thefolklorepodcast.com. Visit the episodes page to find this and previous magazines. You can also sign up to our free monthly newsletter to get advance notice of future guests, exclusive offers and more. Click onto the contact page on the site to do that. Some of you have been very kind in your offers of support for the show using the donate button on our website. This helps us to secure the future of the podcast moving forward and will enable us to develop bigger and better things for you. There's no pressure, but if you're enjoying what we give you and you want to show your support, then the button is there. We love to hear your stories, and you've been emailing in some fascinating personal folklore tales. Use the contact form on the website to send us your tales, and where we can, and you will allow it, we will feature them on future shows. In fact, in the next edition of the Folklore Podcast, we will do just that. One of our listeners sent us a personal story which will be just wonderful to introduce our guest on the next show. My guest on the next Folklore Podcast is David Waldron from Federation University, Australia, who will be addressing the subject of ghost hoaxing. See you next time.
Folklore. The beliefs, traditions and culture of the people. Passed on in the most part through the spoken word, folklore expresses our values, our shared ideas with others. It is both how we were and how we are. Without a record, our customs and traditions may become lost to us in the present, but under the surface, we still draw on them. We still know. It's time to recall our forgotten history and to record the new. This is the Folklore Podcast.
Welcome to episode 5 of the Folklore Podcast, Playing the Ghost. I'm your host, Mark Norman, a folklore writer and researcher based in the southwest of the UK. We all engage with folklore during our daily lives. Here on the Folklore Podcast, we love to hear stories from our listeners which relate to the themes that we discuss on the show. You can contact us via the contact form on our website to send in your thoughts and stories. While you're there, sign up for our free monthly newsletter too, because we'll be using some of your stories in future editions of that. Listener Elizabeth Rimmer did just this. She wrote in to tell us about her experiences surrounding a particular ghost story in her area. She said, "I live in a small village called Camberskeneth on the banks of the River Forth. It has a ruined abbey, and there are plenty of stories about the ghosts of monks wandering about, also of people hearing the cries of children who lived in an orphanage here and worked in the orchards. There isn't much truth in any of this. There was no such orphanage, though the orchards did exist, and the last remnant still does. The only verified sighting of a monk turned out to be an actual monk, a visiting friend of mine, and I put most of the stories down to inherited guilt, the mist in the river valleys, and the fact that Camberskeneth has a long tradition of people coming over the river to drink if they couldn't afford to be seen drinking in Stirling. But the story I'm going to tell is a different one. The mother of an elderly friend of mine had an orchard full of plum trees and apple trees, and miners from Stirling used to cross the river and walk through the village to the pits at Pole Maze, and in autumn they would plunder the trees, much to her annoyance. One year she put on her husband's grey overcoat and a sheet over her head, and waited in the orchard for the miners to arrive. She jumped out at them screeching, and they ran away. She never had any trouble after that. So far, so comical. But 60 years later, when I moved here, elderly miners would still try to discourage me and my friends from walking round the village after dark. The story then took on a new lease of life when I told a young Irish friend the story. Fresh from a family where the Grey Lady was a real and terrifying visitor to hospitals, she refused to visit me ever again. Elizabeth's story demonstrates how the invention of a ghost can continue many years later and begin to be accepted as the genuine article, leading to its embedding in the folklore of the area. This is a form of myth-making in action. My guest on this episode, who will explore these themes, is Dr. David Waldron, a lecturer in the fields of sociology and history at Federation University, Australia. David has made a particular study of the area of Victorian ghost hoaxing, having recently written an extensive article on the subject for the journal Folklore. Instead of an interview, David kindly prepared an exclusive talk for this show under the title Playing the Ghost, Hoaxing and Guising in the Victorian Era. I'll be back at the end of the show, but in the meantime, please enjoy Dr. David Waldron's fascinating talk.
So the subject of playing the ghost, or ghost hoaxing, it was a phenomenon that was quite prolific in the latter part of the 19th century. And it's interesting, it's a story I first came onto through the work of Mike Dash on the character of Spring-Heeled Jack. And I'd also come across this work with regards to the book Spirits of an Industrial Age by Jacob Middleton. And of course, one of the first things that started to come to my mind when I'm reading about these kind of characters in the context of prolific ghost hoaxing in which characters like Spring-Heeled Jack and the resultant legends were formed was whether this was happening elsewhere outside the British Isles. Jacob Middleton certainly didn't think so, but having access to those resources, I began to investigate these kinds of stories using the same sorts of search terms, same sorts of ideas, same themes in which people describe this phenomenon in the British Isles. And incidentally, since then, contact with other colleagues suggests that this is also quite prolific in the United States and Canada. Indeed, it seems to be a phenomenon that stretched right across the British Empire at its heyday. And there's a particular context to these stories. Ghosts were an immensely popular subject in the Victorian era. Ghost stories and hauntings were very popular subjects for entertainment. This is the peak period of Gothic literature. They attracted significant attention in the printed press. They also were quite prolific at public gatherings and lectures. It's also particularly pertinent when we look at the context of Ballarat, a goldfields town in the late 19th century, and one which was formed by huge numbers of rural immigrants from all over the United Kingdom, and they brought their folklore with them. Finding things like witching marks and hexafoils put into the doorway of old mining cottages is quite common. Quite often old churches will have the same kind of markings in the back wall that you find in the British Isles. Exorcisms were quite prolific on the goldfields. And it was also a place that, for all the idealism people had of looking for gold, it was also a period marked by death. Death in the mines, death in childbirth, death through disease, prolific murders. And these sorts of issues, or perhaps particularly pertinent in colonial Australia, were very much also issues going on in the Victorian era. When you think about the impact of death through diseases such as cholera, for example. The other thing is we're also seeing a period of history in which many of the old traditions of folklore are being challenged. At the same time, the new scientific model hasn't really replaced them. We have a lot of synergy between them, particularly through spiritualism. And so it's particularly pertinent in the Australian context, for instance, when Sir Archibald Mitchie, Agent General for the colony of Victoria, a senior government official was brought in to deliver a lecture on ghosts and hauntings. And he argued that, while in a sense there was no scientific evidence for such things, he argued that this was an important part of cultural heritage. He said that if you couldn't believe in ghosts and hauntings, that a man has, and I quote, lost forever the supernatural shudder, the terrifically delicious creeping of the hair, and of the heart creeping into the mouth, attendant on his listening to, or even reading for the first time, an authentic and by justices of the peace attested ghost story. And this kind of attitude that ghost seeing or ghost feeling was uniquely part of the experience of the human condition. And that the decline in the respectability of this belief had also led to a sense of loss in the sublime, the wonder, the connection with the heritage and magic of life, in a sense very much tied into the romantic response to industrialisation and the Enlightenment. So it's quite interesting when we look at the prolific nature of this. It's also a period in which older traditions had been discredited, yet the traditional theological responses, those eschatological responses, had been found wanting. So in a sense, culturally specific beliefs in the spirit world were part of this profound link